Hi folks. Tonight, we journey back into a world wrapped in mystery. A time when plagues moved across the land as common as bread. A bitter kind of daily bread that fed fear more than hunger. This was a world on the edge of something immense. A world that was going through drastic and dramatic changes. And most were not prepared. A time in Europe when few people stayed in isolated rooms, with their faces hidden beneath dark hoods, veiled not in secrecy, but in safety. These were the ones cast aside, outcasts in the eyes of a society afraid of questions. They wrote in silence, in symbols, in delicate curves and loops. They read the stars, they drew curious diagrams, and penned letters in languages not spoken aloud for centuries. They were not magicians, not prophets, not servants of the devil, though many would claim otherwise. They are thinkers, questioners, seekers of patterns, in a world that insists it's already explained. But outside these stone rooms, the world is far less kind to their curiosity. So, before we settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what we do here. And we'd love to know where you're joining us from and what time it is right now for you. It's always fascinating to know how far our boring stories reach. Now, take a deep breath, perhaps dim the lights. Let the world outside begin to soften. Let your imagination gently open. And together, let's ease into tonight's journey. There was a time when to ask why could be dangerous, and to ask how could cost you everything. Why does the moon pull the tides? Why does a fever strike one man down, yet leave another untouched? Why does iron float when shaped like a ship? These are questions that today might earn you a degree, but once they could earn you chains, a trial, a cell with no candlelight, or worse, a flame that did not flicker on a table, but roared at your feet. Why was science once seen as witchcraft? It's a question not easily answered in a single breath, because the answer is not only about the science and not only about the witchcraft. It is about fear and faith, power and control, and above all, it is about people. People who lived and loved and wandered through the fog of the unknown and dared to shine a small, trembling light. Between the fall of the Roman Empire and the first whispers of the Renaissance, Europe became a realm of contradictions. From roughly the year 500 to 1500, 1,000 winters passed across the continent, and in that time the world was not still. It was humming, quietly, carefully, behind monastery walls, in peasant fields, in scholars' cellars, and in the margins of books, but also in prisons, in courtrooms, and tragically, at the stake. This is not a story of villains and heroes. It's a story of questions and what it cost to ask them. To live in medieval Europe was to breathe in uncertainty. The Black Death came in waves, silent and merciless, wiping out entire towns in the space of a week. Fire swept through wooden villages. Crops failed without warning. Children sickened for no visible reason. The sky would darken or glow red, and there would be no explanation, except one. God was angry, or perhaps the devil was near. It was a world ruled not just by kings, but by symbols. Crosses above beds, talismans buried in fields, prayers whispered before crossing rivers. People did not separate the physical from the spiritual. To them, the unseen world bled constantly into the seen. So, when someone came forward with a theory, when someone said, perhaps this fever spreads through touch, or perhaps that star moves by pattern, not will, or perhaps this root can dull pain, they weren't just offering a thought, they were challenging the entire order of reality. It wasn't always malicious. In fact, it often wasn't. The fear of knowledge did not come only from cruelty, but from a desperate need to make sense of chaos. When the world is terrifying, we cling to what gives it meaning, and in medieval Europe, that meaning was shaped almost entirely by the church. Its cathedrals loomed over villages like stone stars. Its priests guided not just prayer, but law, medicine, timekeeping, farming, and education. To understand the world was to understand God, and to understand God, you were told, was the church's work alone. There was little room for doubt. Doubt was rebellion, and rebellion could be branded witchcraft. But even in the shadow of power, minds did not stop. All across Europe, from moss-covered monasteries to bustling Moorish cities, there were people who refused to believe that asking how was a sin, and yet every one of them had to ask it softly, because science, as we would come to call it, did not wear a white coat then. It wore the robes of astrologers, the stains of herbalists, the masks of charlatans, and yes, sometimes the shroud of those accused. And in the minds of the fearful, all were one and the same: the heretic, the witch, the unnatural. So this is our story, a slow unfolding, not of spells and sorcery, but of a time when to understand the body, or the heavens, or the earth, was to walk a knife's edge between wonder and wrath. A time when the line between scholar and sorcerer was drawn not by logic, but by power. We will walk through this era not in judgment, but in observation, carefully, slowly, as though through fog. We'll meet those who dared to see, we'll understand those who feared them, and we'll come to know how, in 1,000 quiet ways, the world as we know it today was born in the smoke of suspicion. When the Western Roman Empire crumbled in the 5th century, it did not fall like a tower in flame, but eroded year by year like parchment left in the rain. Gone were the grand libraries of Alexandria and Carthage, the bustling forums of Roman learning, the teachers, the scribes, the architects, the engineers, dispersed, silenced, forgotten. Without its roads, its order, its armies, the West splintered into kingdoms and chaos, and into that vacuum stepped the Church, not merely as a guide of souls, but as the spine of civilization. It offered structure, identity, a narrative of the world when the old one had turned to dust, but that narrative, pure, total, unshakable, left little room for wandering thoughts. Still, the old thoughts did not entirely die. They smouldered in monasteries, tucked into corners where dust settled on Latin scrolls. It was the monks, in their cold stone rooms, who preserved what they could. Bent over their desks, hour after hour, year after year, they copied texts, often without understanding them. Homer, Galen, Ptolemy, Aristotle, strange names inked onto pages beside psalms and saints. Yet even these echoes of ancient wisdom were curated. Books were chained to desks. Texts deemed too pagan, too curious, too incomplete, were quietly left untranslated. A monk might reproduce a mathematical formula, but fear to speak of its meaning aloud. Knowledge in this time was not a pursuit of freedom, it was a guarded relic. To know was to submit to God's design, to the Church's interpretation. And so, even as curious minds continued to turn beneath the surface, above ground, science as we might imagine it, with its method, its wonder, its trial and error, was missing something crucial: permission. And yet, what do you do when permission never comes? You improvise, you hide, you rebrand. The knowledge seekers of the early medieval world did not call themselves scientists. There was no such word. They were alchemists, philosophers, naturalists, healers. They spoke not of cells or atoms, but of essences and humours, spirits and celestial influences. They wore the language of the mystical because it offered a cloak. It made curiosity look like devotion, and in some cases, it genuinely was. For not every mind that peered into the workings of nature did so to rebel. Many were trying to get closer to the divine by understanding his design. But the distinction between spiritual reverence and dangerous knowledge was a tightrope, and the winds of suspicion were always blowing. Still, slowly, Europe stirred, trade routes reopened, pilgrims walked further, languages mingled, and across the seas, in the dazzling courts of Cordoba and Baghdad, something extraordinary was happening. The ancient texts of Greece and Rome were being translated, studied, expanded, not by Christians, but by Muslim scholars. In libraries lit by oil lamps and cooled by fountains, these thinkers preserved astronomy, medicine, physics, even adding discoveries of their own. In time, these texts would make their way back to Europe, carried by merchants, whispered by travellers, gifted by kings. And when they did, they lit sparks in curious minds that had long gone cold. But these sparks frightened others, for they came bearing questions the Church had not posed, and questions, unchecked, unblessed, were dangerous. They could fracture certainty. They could lead people to trust their senses over the Scriptures. They could unravel the moral fabric the Church had spent centuries weaving. So those sparks were met with suspicion, with interrogation, with fire. A man who healed with herbs might be a doctor or a sorcerer, a woman who predicted storms by watching the sky, a gifted observer or a consort of demons, a scholar who claimed the earth moved, a revolutionary or a heretic. It depended not on truth, but on power, on whose hands held the scales of justice and what frightened them. But for every book burned, another was hidden. For every thinker silenced, another began to write. Ideas do not die easily. They wait in cupboards, in caves, in code, and in time, they rise again. For centuries, the Roman Empire had stretched its arms across Europe and the Mediterranean, a colossus of roads, aqueducts, marketplaces, law and learning. In its marble halls, engineers measured water pressure, doctors debated anatomy, astronomers plotted the planets on parchment illuminated by oil lamps. Knowledge, practical and theoretical, flowed through its cities like blood through veins. But even empires tire, and by the late 5th century, Rome was gasping. Barbarian invasions, internal decay, economic fractures, political betrayals, all came together like storm clouds over a dying sun. In 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire collapsed. Its last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was dethroned by a Germanic warlord. The imperial throne, once a symbol of absolute order, was reduced to silence. What followed was not peace, it was disarray. Without a central authority to maintain the intricate machinery of governance, the cities of the West began to decay. Trade routes shattered, bridges fell into disrepair, aqueducts, once miracles of precision, crumbled beneath creeping vines and moss. And with that decay came a terrible silence in the world of ideas. The great libraries of the West, once repositories of centuries of accumulated wisdom, were sacked, burned, or simply left to rot. Scrolls were lost to mould and fire, codices repurposed for firewood or bandages. In Alexandria, in Carthage, in Trier, in Londinium, knowledge disappeared, not with a scream, but with a long, unrecorded sigh. It is said that when a library burns, it is not just paper that dies, but memory. And so it was. The memory of the world grew dim. The scholars of old, the ones who had debated the curvature of Earth, the ones who had measured the pulse and mapped the stars, were gone. Some were killed in battle, others were scattered, fleeing collapsing cities, their manuscripts abandoned on rain-soaked carts. Still others faded into obscurity, their names surviving only in footnotes, or not at all. In their absence, a question rose like mist over the ruins. Who now would carry the light of knowledge? The answer came not from kings, nor from armies. It came from men in robes who prayed in Latin. In the centuries that followed Rome's fall, a new structure began to form. One that was not built with brick and marble, but with prayer and parchment. The monastery. Scattered across hills, nestled in forests, perched beside rivers, monasteries became the new centres of continuity. Their stone walls offered stability in a crumbling world. Their bells marked time. Their cloisters echoed with whispered psalms, and, quietly, the scratching of quills. The scriptoria, a monk's copying room, was a sanctuary of slow salvation. There, in the flickering light of a candle, monks bent their heads over ancient texts. Carefully, reverently, they traced faded letters with fresh ink, preserving fragments of Plato, Galen, Pliny, Aristotle. It was meticulous work. One error, and a generation might misunderstand an entire theory, but preservation came with a cost. Monasteries did not just copy knowledge, they filtered it. They preserved what aligned with doctrine, and redacted what did not. Texts that contradicted scripture, or introduced ideas too steeped in pagan reasoning, were often left untranslated, or were deliberately corrected in the margins. A heliocentric diagram might be erased. A reference to multiple gods softened. The sharp edges of classical curiosity dulled to fit the frame of faith. Still, their work was not without value. Without the monks of the early medieval world, we might not know much of ancient philosophy at all. Their devotion, even if bound by obedience, kept the flame of learning alive, though it burned low and often in secret corners. They believed deeply that all truth came from God. But in their eyes, truth was not to be tested, it was to be received, revealed, not discovered. And so the idea that one might experiment, observe, challenge, was not encouraged. Instead, knowledge was something fixed, like stained glass, unchanging, casting coloured light, but never shifting shape. And yet, within those walls, under layers of ritual and reverence, ancient seeds were tucked into the soil, waiting for another spring. By the 6th and 7th centuries, the Church was not merely one spiritual path among many. It was the spine of European identity. Kings knelt before its bishops. Peasants crossed themselves at the sound of its bells. Its influence stretched from the cradle to the grave, marking baptisms, marriages, deaths, and the laws that governed between them. In a world that had lost its empire, the Church became the empire of the mind. And at the heart of this intellectual reign was a man named Augustine of Hippo. Living in the final decades of Rome's decline, Augustine became one of the most influential thinkers of Christian philosophy. To him, all truth, whether found in scripture or in nature, belonged to God. But he also issued a caution. If reason leads you to doubt what faith reveals, then it is reason that must bend. This principle, faith over logic, would shape medieval thought for nearly a millennium. Under Augustine's legacy, the idea of science became reframed. It was not about uncovering how the world worked, but rather how the world reflected the will of God. Natural phenomena were not mechanisms, but messages. Lightning was not electricity, it was judgment. A malformed child was not a result of genes or illness. It was a sign, a warning, perhaps even a punishment. In such a framework, to probe too deeply, to ask how rather than why, could be interpreted not as curiosity, but as insubordination. To question the natural order was to question divine intent, and that, in the eyes of the medieval church, was perilously close to heresy. And so, under the church's wing, knowledge was allowed to survive, but only in forms that bowed their heads to scripture. This was not accidental. It was policy and belief interwoven. Universities, when they began to emerge, were often founded under religious oversight. The University of Paris, the University of Oxford, the University of Bologna. These hallowed institutions were not temples of independent thought as we might imagine today. They were in many ways theological engines. Students could study logic, but only within a framework that upheld God's primacy. They could read Aristotle, but only the parts filtered through Christian commentators. In time, certain branches of inquiry, astronomy, medicine, mathematics, were permitted cautiously, but always with the unspoken boundary, thou shalt not contradict doctrine. This tethering of science to faith created a strange duality. On one hand, the church protected learning. It provided libraries. It funded copyists. It maintained Latin as a scholarly tongue across borders. On the other, it also became gatekeeper. Ideas were not judged by their coherence or their evidence, but by their alignment with theological truth. A theory of the stars might be brilliant, but if it implied the earth was not the center of creation, it was suspect. A method of healing might be effective, but if it challenged the doctrine of suffering as divine will, it was dangerous. And thus, the roots of suspicion began to settle. Knowledge, once pursued openly in forums and academies, became something that had to be negotiated, justified, sometimes disguised. If a scholar had an idea that stretched the known order, they had two options: wrap it in theology or keep it quiet. Still, knowledge is a current. You may dam it, but it finds cracks in the minds of students and teachers, in the whispers between monks, in the diagrams hidden in the margins of holy texts. Science survived. Bent, yes, but not broken. And among the faithful, there were those who believed that understanding the world, truly understanding it, was a kind of worship. That God, having created the stars, the bones, the tides, would be honored, not angered, by those who sought to grasp their rhythms. But this idea, this gentle rebellion, was fragile. for all around it, the culture of fear was beginning to thicken, and that fear had a face. It looked like heresy. In the early centuries of medieval Europe, heresy was not yet the grand machinery of inquisition we associate with later times, but it was real, and it was feared. To be declared a heretic was not simply to be called wrong, it was to be unmade, socially, spiritually, physically. A heretic could be exiled, tortured, executed, their writings burned, their names scrubbed from memory, and the line between a curious thinker and a heretic was thin and shifting. It was in this climate that science, humble, hopeful, human, became entangled with suspicion, not because it sought evil, but because it asked for clarity in a world ruled by mystery, because it trusted patterns over pronouncements, and that trust made it dangerous. The Church, for all its preservation of the past, became wary of futures it could not script. In its eyes, knowledge without guidance was not freedom, it was temptation. The same temptation that had once lured Eve in the garden to eat the fruit of understanding, and in so doing fall from grace. And thus the old metaphor became law. To seek too much, to know too deeply, was to risk damnation. This is the world that followed the fall of Rome. Not a dark age, but a dim one. A world of candlelight, where ideas moved slowly, carefully, lest they provoke a storm. A world where monks copied Plato by hand, but where questioning divine order might still cost you your life. A world where the stars were beautiful, but better left unexplained, and yet, in the shadows of ruined temples behind monastery walls, deep in forested valleys where whispers of the old empire still lingered, a new kind of mind was beginning to stir, not to destroy the old order, but to understand it more clearly, to honor faith by exploring form, to reawaken the ancient belief that the world was not just a mystery to worship, but a puzzle to gently, reverently solve. And in that quiet stirring lay the seeds of everything to come. Before there was chemistry, there was alchemy, and to understand why it was once called witchcraft, we must first understand what it really was. Alchemy was not simply the art of turning lead into gold, though that is how it's often remembered. It was a philosophy of change, of growth, of refinement, of inner and outer evolution. It sought to reveal the hidden structure beneath nature, and perhaps by doing so, uplift the soul. The roots of alchemy trace back, not to Europe, but to the dusty scrolls of Greco-Egyptian Alexandria. There, in the centuries before Christ, philosophers blended Greek logic with Egyptian mysticism. They studied the properties of metals, the behavior of fire, the patterns of decay and rebirth. To them, all matter was a combination of elemental forces, earth, air, fire, water, bound by hidden laws. And within those laws, they believed, lay a single sacred key, the power to transform. When Rome fell and the libraries of the West grew silent, the East, particularly the Islamic world, picked up the thread. In the courts of the Abbasid Caliphate, knowledge was not feared. It was celebrated. Greek texts were translated into Arabic, commentaries flourished, and alchemy evolved. No longer just a theory, it became a practice, blending mysticism with experimentation. Scholars like Jabir ibn Hayyan, known in the West as Geber, wrote extensively on substances, distillation, crystallization, and the idea that all things, when purified, could become something higher. To Jabir, turning lead to gold wasn't just a material act. It was a symbol, a metaphor for the purification of the soul, for lifting the base self into enlightenment. This was alchemy's true heart, a fusion of material science and spiritual ascent. In time, these Arabic works, along with fragments of Greek originals, made their way into Europe, through Spain, where Muslim, Jewish and Christian scholars coexisted briefly in fragile collaboration, through Sicily, where translations quietly spread among monastic communities, and through the Crusades, where knights returned not only with relics and wounds, but with books filled with strange diagrams, exotic symbols, and promises. Promises that even the lowest of metals might become noble, that even the common man might grasp divine truths, that through effort, study, and vision one might change not only matter, but oneself. This idea took root in the medieval mind like a spark in dry grass, because it spoke to a longing that went deeper than gold. It whispered that the world was not fixed, but fluid, that the boundaries between elements, between man and spirit, lead and gold, sickness and health, were not walls, but veils, thin ones, waiting to be parted. Soon, across Europe, alchemists began to appear. Some were monks, some were nobles, some were wanderers who carried little more than a pouch of powders and a book with no title. They built laboratories in cellars, beneath churches, inside castle towers. They distilled, melted, cooled, etched, scribbled, and through smoke and solitude they reached for the elusive dream, the philosopher's stone, a legendary substance said to transmute any metal into gold and grant eternal life. It was never found, but the search for it, that long, slow, dangerous search, would drive centuries of inquiry and would bring alchemists both awe and accusation. Alchemists did not write plainly. Their works were riddled with symbols, ciphers, and veiled language, not because they wished to deceive, but because they wished to survive. To describe Mercury's properties, they might draw a dragon consuming its own tail. To speak of sulfur, they might reference the sun or the soul. The union of opposites, of fire and water, male and female, was drawn not as a formula, but as a wedding of mythical creatures. Why? Because to speak too clearly about the transformation of matter was to risk being misunderstood, or worse, accused. The Church tolerated alchemy barely. As long as it was cloaked in religious metaphors, as long as it did not challenge doctrine, it was viewed as an odd, almost spiritual craft. But the line was thin, and alchemists knew it. So they wrote in riddles. They claimed to be seeking God's hidden design, not subverting it. They portrayed their experiments not as attempts to manipulate nature, but to understand divine harmony. For alchemy was not just about external transformation, it was about internal purification. Lead was not only a base metal, it was the base self. Through fire, it was said, both metal and man might be refined. This blending of science and spirituality made alchemy intoxicating, but also deeply vulnerable, because to purify the soul through science was to suggest that spiritual ascent could happen without the church, and that was a dangerous suggestion. In time, alchemy's language grew more elaborate. Diagrams spiraled with serpents and suns. Books bore titles in Latin, Greek, Arabic, or all three. A single paragraph might require years of study to interpret, and often that was the point, to protect the knowledge from misuse, from corruption, from the flames of those who did not understand it. Still, the protection was not always enough. The suspicion grew, because where there is secrecy, there is fear, and where there is fear, there is fire. By the late Middle Ages, to be an alchemist, even a cautious one, was to carry a quiet fear, not just of failure, but of being found with powders of unknown origin, with symbols no priest could read, with a text translated from Arabic, bearing diagrams that glowed with a meaning too precise for coincidence. What began as curiosity, what once wore the robes of mysticism and devotion, was now, in many eyes, deception, worse yet, blasphemy. The idea that one could transform matter, that one could create, that a mortal hand might imitate the creator. This was no longer simply strange, it was sacrilegious. And so, alchemy's golden dream began to darken. It was now whispered in the same breath as sorcery, because what else, some asked, could explain its secrets? The colour-changing fluids, the powders that burned green or purple, the writings that mentioned stars and spirits in the same breath. It looked to many like the devil's work. And if it could not be understood, it had to be controlled. In towns across Europe, especially as the 14th century waned and the 15th century rose, suspicion turned violent. Alchemists were arrested, sometimes for fraud, sometimes for heresy, sometimes for merely owning the wrong book. Their laboratories were searched and their manuscripts seized, furnaces were smashed, crucibles hurled to the ground, shelves overturned, and in the centre of the room, often trembling, stood a man, sometimes a woman, who had never cast a spell, only studied fire. Some were brought to trial, not always in courts of law, but before inquisitions, or the judgment of townsfolk, whipped into fear. Questions were sharp. Did they summon spirits? Did they claim to heal? Did they believe they could create gold? Did they think they could live forever? And worst of all, did they believe knowledge could be gained outside the church's blessing? If the answer leaned too far toward yes, or even if it was simply not know enough, the result could be imprisonment, or exile, or, in some tragic cases, execution. In Cologne, in Avignon, in Prague. Records emerge of alchemists imprisoned, tortured, or burned, their names often lost, their works destroyed or hidden by apprentices who fled in the night. Sometimes their books resurface centuries later, singed, stained, scribbled with annotations in the margins like dying whispers. Do not show this page. Tell no one what you saw. The salt does not work unless the moon is full. Fragments of voices left behind by those who dared to seek. But even as persecution grew, alchemy did not vanish because, like the elements it sought to transform, it adapted. Some alchemists cloaked their work as medicine, exploring herbalism, tinctures, and distillation as if they were merely tending to the sick. Others folded themselves into Christian mysticism, writing texts that tied the philosopher's stone to Christ, or described spiritual rebirth in the language of saints and sacraments. A few were protected by wealthy patrons, nobles and princes who saw alchemy not as heresy, but as a path to riches. Even the papal courts on occasion funded alchemists, hoping they might at last unlock the secret of endless gold to fund crusades or fill war coffers. And so alchemy lived in paradox. It was feared and desired, outlawed and commissioned, condemned in public, and studied in secret. Because beneath the smoke and secrecy, one truth remained: alchemy worked. Not in the way legends claimed. No man turned lead into gold, no one drank immortality. But its methods, careful observation, repeated trials, refined tools, laid a foundation. They created instruments, furnaces, flasks, balances. They refined materials, acids, salts, metals, dyes. They recorded failures, something few others bothered to do. They noticed patterns, and in this quiet accumulation of technique and attention, alchemy began to birth science. But that was centuries away. In the medieval moment, the alchemist's dilemma was unresolved. They stood between worlds, one foot in spiritual tradition, the other in physical experimentation, praised by those in search of healing, hunted by those who smelled sulfur and saw sin. And the more alchemy revealed the laws of nature, the more it threatened those who claimed to speak for the law of God. For if one could understand the workings of the body without referencing the soul, if one could predict planetary motion without invoking angels, if one could explain transformation through cause and effect, then what need was there for mystery? What need was there for miracles? This is why alchemy, so hopeful, so reverent in its beginnings, became so feared, because it blurred the line between science and faith, between human and divine, between reverence and rebellion, and in a world where stepping over the line could bring fire. Alchemists learned to walk carefully or disappear altogether. Yet even in hiding, even in code, they kept writing, because deep down they believed something few dared to say aloud, that the world was not static. It could change, and so could we, not through sorcery, but through knowledge, patiently earned, one bubbling flask at a time. The return of Aristotle. It began with a trickle, a handful of texts, old, worn, copied from copy upon copy, making their way into Moorish Spain. There, in the cities of Toledo and Cordoba, something extraordinary had happened. Muslim, Christian, and Jewish scholars, for a brief and fragile time, had lived and learned together. Within these multicultural courts, knowledge from across the known world had gathered: astronomy from Persia, medicine from India, mathematics from Alexandria, but most striking of all were the forgotten Greek texts, preserved in Arabic, among them the works of Aristotle. The rediscovery of Aristotle in the 12th and 13th centuries was like finding a map to a hidden world. He had written of causes, material, formal, efficient, final. He had described biology, logic, physics, metaphysics, not as myth, but as structure. The world to Aristotle was not random or magical. It was ordered, and more dangerously still, knowable. These texts were translated into Latin by scholars such as Gerard of Cremona, working from Arabic originals. From Sicily, North Africa, and the Eastern Mediterranean, they poured into European universities, newly forming and hungry for curriculum. Students who had once studied little more than scripture and syllogism were now reading texts that spoke of empirical observation, of demonstration over revelation, of natural laws, not divine exception. The ideas struck like lightning, not because they denied God, but because they didn't need him to explain everything. Rain didn't fall because heaven was angry. It fell because of condensation. A child wasn't born with illness because of sin, but possibly because of imbalance or cause and effect. The world could be studied, mapped, understood not as a mirror of divine will, but as a system of relationships. To those with curious minds, it was exhilarating. To others, it was deeply unsettling. Because if nature could be explained without constant reference to God, then what exactly was left for faith to explain? The church noticed, and soon the boundaries were being drawn. The year was 1277. In the great halls of the University of Paris, murmurs had turned to alarm. Theology professors, increasingly disturbed by how far Aristotle's influence had crept into lectures and debates, called for clarity and control. Students were quoting the philosopher more than the prophets. Some were even suggesting, tentatively, that reason might correct faith. And so, the Bishop of Paris, Etienne Tempier, issued a formal condemnation. In it, he banned 219 philosophical and scientific propositions from being taught, studied, or defended. Among the banned ideas included that the world is eternal and had no beginning, that God cannot move the heavens in a straight line, that natural causes are sufficient to explain physical change. In essence, any notion that God was not needed to explain the universe was now heretical. This was not a call for censorship in the modern sense. It was a spiritual line drawn in intellectual sand, one that divided the safe inquiries, those that supported the Church's worldview, from the dangerous ones which could unravel it. And yet, the condemnation had an unintended consequence. It made scholars more cautious, but also more precise. If one was to discuss motion, matter, or medicine without invoking heresy, one had to define terms carefully, use observation, logic, proof, in a paradox only history could arrange. The fear of error pushed some toward greater rigour, as if, to stay within bounds, they had to map them more accurately than ever before. But others felt the wall closing in, especially those who worked with what might be called natural magic. To study nature in the 13th and 14th centuries was to walk a knife's edge. A man who measured the stars might be an astronomer or an astrologer. A woman who healed with herbs might be a physician or a witch. A scholar who dissected bones for knowledge might be seen as a genius, or as one who defiled the sacred. The tools of inquiry, a bone knife, a mortar and pestle, a chart of constellations, could look suspiciously like the tools of sorcery, and worse yet, their results could blur lines the Church had fought to define. If a disease could be cured without prayer, if the movement of a comet could be predicted, if herbs could dull pain more reliably than relics, then where precisely did divine power begin? And where did human knowledge trespass? This was the fear behind the phrase natural magic. It did not mean casting spells or making pacts with demons. It meant using the natural world, bones, herbs, minerals, weather, to create change, real, visible, tangible change, change that looked powerful, and in a world where all true power was supposed to come from God, that made it dangerous. It is here that suspicion began to crystallize, not just around what was practiced, but around who practiced it. Healers, midwives, herbalists, especially women, became targets. So too did wandering scholars, astrologers, and anyone whose knowledge outpaced their title. If they had no church license, if they answered questions too confidently, if they worked alone, they might be accused, not of error, but of witchcraft. It did not matter if their intentions were pure, nor if their cures worked, nor even if they prayed, if their methods resembled the strange, if their tools resembled the mystical, if their knowledge was too quick, too unexplainable, or too confident. They could be taken, accused, judged, because in the eyes of the fearful, certainty without permission was a sign of pact. To know, without being told by the church, to heal, without calling on a saint, to predict, without divine revelation. That was not brilliance, it was hubris. And hubris in the medieval world was not just arrogance, it was a doorway through which devils were believed to walk. The suspicion deepened in towns where death had struck suddenly, where a crop had failed, where lightning had split a chapel roof. Who had been reading the stars? Who had ground those herbs? Who had been seen gathering bones in the forest? It was easy, terrifyingly easy, to turn a healer into a heretic, to turn a curious student into a conjurer, to turn a question into a crime. Even the study of bones, for medicine, for understanding the body, was now eyed with distrust. To open a body, to peer inside its structure, to map its organs, was not viewed as science. It was seen by many as violation. The body was sacred, made in God's image. To cut it was to desecrate it, even if the motive was healing, even if the motive was truth. And so, many early anatomists worked in secret, dissecting the bodies of criminals or unclaimed corpses by moonlight, racing the decay. They wrote cautiously, or not at all, because to be caught was to be marked. And still, the books kept circulating, not openly, but hand to hand, cloak to cloak, tomes from the East, translations from old tongues, copied by candlelight and hidden beneath floorboards, texts that spoke of balance, not between good and evil, but between salt and sulphur, blood and bile, writings that saw in herbs not witchcraft, but chemistry, charts that saw in stars not prophecy, but pattern, books that whispered that the world might be understood. And yet, books could not defend themselves. If one was found in your possession, even one you hadn't read, it could be enough to summon suspicion, enough to warrant questioning, enough if the season was wrong and the mood of the crowd was sour, to bring you to the edge of fire. That is the tragedy and the miracle of this chapter in our story. The same forces that sought to silence knowledge also preserved it. A monk might copy Aristotle with one hand and condemn a healer with the other. A bishop might ban a theory in court, then secretly read it by night. A university might expel a student for heresy, but only after adding his notes to their archives. Truth was not so much forbidden as it was postponed, kept under lock and key, until the locks rusted, until the keys changed hands, until the wind of a new century began to blow. But in the world of the 13th and 14th centuries, the air was still tense, still thick with fear, of books that asked too much, of bones that revealed too much, of magic that wasn't magic at all, just science waiting for a different name, a name that wouldn't come for hundreds of years, a name spoken without shame. But here, in these centuries, in the quiet turn between candle and flame, that name was not yet safe, and so the knowledge remained in the shadows, waiting, listening, breathing beneath the floorboards of power. Witches and wise women. In villages across medieval Europe, far from the cathedrals and cloisters where scholars debated angels and astronomy, knowledge lived in simpler ways. It passed not through ink, but through voice, not in Latin, but in whispers around the fire, and more often than not, it passed through the hands of women. These women, midwives, herbalists, wise women, were pillars of their communities. They helped bring life into the world. They treated wounds and fevers. They offered charms to ward off sickness or dreams or the fear of unknown nights. Their tools were plants, stones, rituals and instinct, honed through generations. They didn't study in universities. They didn't write treatises, but they knew. They knew that chamomile soothed the nerves, that nettle could build the blood, that yarrow could stop bleeding. They knew how to ease a child's colic, how to guide a mother through childbirth, how to recognize the signs of infection before it spread. And their knowledge came not from scripture, but from experience, from centuries of trial and error, from watching and remembering. But this was precisely the problem. Because their learning was practical, not theological, because they relied on nature, not ritual, because they were often right and could not explain it in the language of doctrine, they became suspect. The Church, for its part, had long tolerated folk healing, just barely. It allowed charms, so long as they were paired with a prayer. It permitted midwifery, so long as the sacraments were observed. But over time, especially as scholastic theology hardened into orthodoxy, the gap between folk knowledge and official doctrine began to widen, and women found themselves standing on the wrong side of it. Their herbalism? Dangerous. Their moon-based planting calendars? Pagan. Their knowledge of fertility and childbirth? Unnatural. Their intuition? Unexplainable. Their independence? Unforgivable. It is no coincidence that many of the women who were later accused of witchcraft were the very same women villagers once turned to for help. They were visible, respected in a quiet way, and when things went wrong, blamed. A child dies in the night. A cow won't produce milk. A marriage fails to bear fruit. Who was nearby? Who had touched the child? Who gave the tonic? Who lived alone at the edge of the village? The same hands that once healed were now seen as the hands of a witch. This wasn't just superstition, it was a profound clash of worldviews. On one side, a local, earthy, deeply practical knowledge tradition, passed down through matrilineal lines, tested in kitchens and fields. On the other, a rising tide of academic, male-dominated, church-approved science, rooted in Aristotle and Aquinas, written in languages ordinary people could not read. And when these worlds met, it was not collaboration, it was conflict. A woman who healed without training was reckless. A woman who spoke of stars without Latin was a fraud. A woman who questioned a priest was dangerous. And a woman who did all three was a witch. Or at least, she was close enough. Still, for a time, these women continued their work. Their cures still helped. Their neighbours still came to them in the dark. But something had shifted. Something colder, more watchful, and it would soon find a voice, a book, a hammer. The year is 1487, and a book is about to be printed. Not a holy text, not a medical manual, but a weapon, bound not in steel, but in ink. Its title, the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. It would become one of the most infamous texts of the late medieval world. A handbook, not for healing, but for hunting, for rooting out witches, for identifying them, for questioning them, for condemning them. Its tone was not speculative, it was absolute. Authored by two Dominican inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, the Malleus was written with urgency and venom. It did not merely suggest that witches were real, it declared it. It argued forcefully that disbelief in witches was itself heresy, that women were especially susceptible to witchcraft, that midwives, healers, herbalists and widows were all likely to consort with devils, and perhaps most chillingly, it laid out methods for interrogation, which herbs to look for, which confessions to expect, which signs revealed a pact with Satan, how to question a woman until she broke, how to justify the breaking. And in an age of suspicion, the book found eager hands. The printing press, still a relatively new invention, allowed copies to spread faster than fire, from town to town, from bishopric to courtroom, from whispered accusation to documented procedure. Suddenly the fear of witches was no longer just cultural or local. It was codified. And it fused terribly with the scientific suspicion already brewing, because many of the same women, the midwives, the weather readers, the medicine makers, were now twice marked. Not only did they bypass clerical control, not only did they traffic in natural knowledge, but now they were named as collaborators with devils, not metaphorically, literally. And the church, though divided at times in its stance, did not stop the tide. Secular courts picked it up. Local leaders enforced it. Communities, desperate for control, for scapegoats, for order, began to turn inward. A woman with too many cats. A woman who could cure fevers. A woman who spoke to herself while grinding herbs. Each became a suspect, each a potential portal to evil. The irony is as cruel as it is clear. For centuries, these women had offered comfort where the church could not. They had tended the sick when priests could only pray. They had soothed pain when relics failed. They had brought life into the world when others stood back, and now that very usefulness, that knowledge, was the mark against them. To know too much, to heal too well, to speak too confidently, was to court accusation, and once accused, the outcome was almost certain. Some fled, some confessed falsely to stop the pain, some died silent, some cursed their judges with their last breath. All were lost, not just as lives, but as carriers of knowledge. Each death, each trial, each stake extinguished a thread of medicine, of wisdom, of earth-bound science, knowledge that had passed from grandmother to mother to daughter, cut off by fear. And yet, the roots ran deep, deeper than fire, because though the Malleus cast a long shadow, it could not unmake centuries of lived experience, and in small ways, in hidden gardens, in whispered prayers that sounded like lullabies, the knowledge survived, bent, wounded, but not broken. There is a question, never spoken aloud, yet whispered beneath every accusation, every trial, every burning. Why women? Why, when suspicion swept across medieval Europe like fog over moorland, did it so often settle on women? The answers were many, but none were simple. Part of it was doctrine. The Church had long taught that woman was the weaker vessel, more prone to temptation, more ruled by emotion, more easily swayed by carnal influence. Eve had sinned first. It was she who had bitten the fruit. It was she who had listened to the serpent. And in that ancient myth, medieval minds saw prophecy. that women were not just physically weaker, but morally fragile. And so when someone began to speak with confidence about the stars, when she spoke of dreams and mixtures and cures, when she spoke without shame, her voice became a threat, because she was not supposed to know. Not like that, not publicly, not with certainty. Men who claimed insight, even strange insight, could be eccentric or brilliant or misguided, but women, if they spoke of the hidden forces of nature, if they touched the dying and eased their pain, if they guessed the weather, if they birthed babies that lived, there must be a darker source behind their power. They could not be smarter, only more sinister. And so, a strange inversion took hold. The more skilled a woman was, the more likely she was to be feared. A woman who had lived too long, a widow in her 70s, stooped but sharp, might be seen as unnatural. A young woman who lived alone and did not marry might be accused of seduction or spells. A midwife who had lost a child during birth, through no fault of her own, might be blamed for making a pact. A girl who knew how to read might be eyed with suspicion. The reasons were rarely consistent, but the target was. Over time, the image of the witch became more than accusation. It became an idea, a vessel for every hidden fear, every unanswered sorrow, every unease the church could not soothe and the doctor could not heal. The witch was the scapegoat. The other, the one who lived just outside the village, just beyond understanding. She was the shadow in a world struggling to explain the dark. And still, the science she practiced, if we dare call it that, and we should, was real. She was testing herbs, measuring doses, observing symptoms. She was engaging in what we would one day call trial and error, botany, anatomy, naturopathy, psychology, but she lacked the shield of status. She had no church behind her, no university robes, no Latin texts stamped with a bishop's seal. All she had was her own knowledge and the trust of those who came to her, until that trust cracked. Until a child's illness, until a cow's death, until a harsh winter made a village hungry for blame, and then the fire. History often remembers the witch trials as madness, as hysteria, but they were not chaos. They were controlled, organized. They served a purpose, not just to punish, but to silence, to erase a whole way of knowing that did not bow to hierarchy, a way of knowing rooted in the land, in the body, in the eyes of women. And so, the scientific mind of the medieval woman, passed from hand to hand, whispered between generations, was slowly hunted into silence. But not completely. Because no fire is perfect, no book burning finds every copy, no trial stops every thought, and even in the height of terror, the seeds of resistance still found soil. The sky has always been a canvas for wonder, long before telescopes or equations, before satellites and spacefaring dreams. The stars were stories. They guided ships, marked seasons, lit the path of migrating birds and farmers alike. But for medieval minds, they did more than shine. They spoke, and sometimes they warned. A falling star could mean a soul had passed. A blood-red moon could signal plague. A comet streaking across the sky, a king's death. A war, a shift in power, up above, vast, cold, unreachable, The heavens were not just beautiful, they were divine signs. Yet not all agreed on what they meant, and the closer one looked, the more dangerous the questions became. In the Middle Ages, the line between astronomy and astrology was not clear. It was a blurred, shifting space, like mist on the edge of a forest. To study the positions of stars was to observe God's creation. To interpret those positions was to risk overstepping. At court, astrology had its place. Kings consulted star charts before battles. Queens asked astrologers to pick auspicious days for childbirth or marriage. Even the church, at times, allowed for natural astrology, so long as it didn't claim to override divine will. But among peasants, among commoners, among those without a title, reading the stars was less tolerated. The same tools used by court astrologers, charts, compasses, symbols, could be seen as sorcery in the hands of a village herbalist or a wandering scholar. It was not the method that offended, but who used it. A nobleman with a golden astrolabe was wise. A poor woman with a set of star runes was damned. The suspicion was partly about power. If anyone could read the stars, then anyone could claim to know the future. And if anyone could know the future, what did that mean for prophecy, for fate, for the church? The stars, after all, belonged to heaven, and heaven, they said, was God's domain. To map it too precisely, to chart its rhythms, to predict its behaviors. That was bold, too bold, almost defiant. And in time, even the church's tolerance for noble astrologers would begin to waver, because some men were not content to read the stars. They wanted to understand them, to explain their movement, to rewrite the heavens, not with myth, but with math, and that would become a curse. By the 14th and 15th centuries, star charts were no longer just curiosities for kings and mystics. They had become instruments of precision. Astronomers, often working quietly under the protection of monasteries or universities, were collecting data with meticulous care. They mapped the paths of planets across the sky, noting their speeds, their patterns, their retrogrades. They compared records. They corrected errors passed down from Ptolemy and earlier Greek models, and in doing so, they began to see flaws in what had long been taught. For centuries, the Church had upheld the Ptolemaic system, a model that placed the Earth at the unmoving centre of the universe, with the sun, moon, and planets revolving in perfect spheres around it. This vision wasn't just theological, it was symbolic. Earth, home of man, of sin, of salvation, was at the heart. The heavens, perfect and changeless, circled around it. It was a model that reinforced the hierarchy of heaven over earth, of spirit over flesh, of church over creation. To challenge it was to challenge order itself. But the stars did not behave. Planets wobbled, their speeds varied, eclipses came unexpectedly. The spheres, it seemed, were not so perfect after all. Some scholars began to propose alternative models, cautiously. That maybe the Earth wasn't at the centre, that maybe it was the sun, that maybe the planets followed elliptical paths, not circles, that maybe, just maybe, the universe was governed by motion, not mystery. These were not yet revolutions, they were whispers, and at first they were tolerated because they were framed as mathematical models, not truths. They were presented as useful tools for calculation, not as challenges to faith. But the Church was watching. And when some began to suggest that these models were not just helpful, but true, the Inquisition turned its gaze upward. One of the earliest to feel the sting of suspicion was John of Paris. a 13th century theologian who dared to suggest that God might have created multiple worlds, not just one. Others, like Nicole Oresme and John Buridan, hinted that the Earth's motion was a plausible explanation for celestial irregularities. They posed careful questions, never outright denial, but even questions in the wrong century could invite scrutiny. Because what did it mean if the Earth moved? What did it mean if we were not the center? If the heavens did not revolve around us? What did it say about God's design, about our importance, about the scriptures that spoke of a fixed firmament? To some, these were innocent thoughts. To others, they were the first notes in a song of heresy. And so, scholars walked carefully. They published under false names. They included disclaimers. This is merely a mathematical device, not to be taken as literal. They added invocations of God, saints and angels, even in works of astronomy, hoping to pacify the senses. Some escaped notice, some did not. The stars, once symbols of divine perfection, had become evidence, cold, silent, irrefutable. And to those who feared what they might reveal, that silence was terrifying. When a comet appeared, bright, wild, with a tail like a sword slicing the heavens, it was rarely welcomed. To medieval minds, this was not a rare orbital event. It was a sign, a tear in the firmament, a warning from above. Comets foretold calamity, a ruler's death, the outbreak of war, a heresy brewing in the hearts of men. Even the most devout church leaders who publicly denounced astrology would often flinch at such sightings, because belief, even when denied, has a way of clinging to the soul. In 1066, just before the Norman invasion of England, a comet blazed across the sky. The chroniclers of the time, monks, abbots, scribes, recorded it in fear. They called it an omen, a divine signal, a fire hair in the sky. And when the invasion succeeded, the comet's power was remembered, confirmed, etched into law. Its image was even woven into the Bayeux tapestry, where it hovers above trembling figures, not as art, but as judgment. These celestial portents shaped politics as much as prophecy. Rulers hired astrologers not only for guidance, but for protection, to know when to act, when to wait, when to declare war, when to bury bad omens under rituals and gold. A bad sign in the stars could delay a wedding, a blood moon could cancel a coronation, a solar eclipse, sudden, total, terrifying, could bring mass panic as birds fell silent and shadows shifted in unnatural ways. The fear was not in the science, it was in the not knowing, in the vastness of the cosmos, cold, untouchable, and the terrible idea that it might be speaking in a language we only barely understood. Astronomers tried to explain. They spoke of orbits, cycles, conjunctions. But their words were often drowned out by sermons and panic, because while science asked how, people wanted to know why. Why now? Why here? Why us? And the church, caught between cosmology and catastrophe, often offered the simplest answer: repent. This posture, half awe, half anxiety, lingered for centuries. It ensured that even those who studied the stars had to do so with humility, or at least the appearance of it. To gaze too boldly, to suggest that the heavens were not messages but mechanisms, was still seen in many quarters as arrogance, as rebellion, as danger. And so the stargazer's curse remained, to look up and see more, but be forced to say less. Even the most careful astronomers, like Tycho Brahe, who catalogued stars with obsessive precision, or Johannes Kepler, who saw in their movement the grace of geometry, knew they were walking a line. Every discovery had to be framed within faith. Every insight had to be wrapped in praise, not just for the sake of belief, but for safety. Because the sky may have been vast, but the world below was small. Its minds were not always ready for truth without poetry. Its powers were rarely gentle with those who dared to rewrite the stars. And yet, slowly, steadily, the questions kept rising. With every new observation, every corrected chart, every eclipse that came and passed without catastrophe, the fear began to fracture. The awe remained, but the terror softened. The stars were still mysterious, but they no longer had to be divine messengers. They could be phenomena, natural, predictable, beautiful. And in that shift lies the very heart of science, not the abandonment of wonder, but its reframing from symbol to system, from myth to meaning. For centuries, the human body was seen not as a machine to be studied, but as a divine vessel, fashioned in God's image. Its structure was a reflection of spiritual design, not biological function, and so to tamper with it, especially after death, was seen as profoundly wrong. The Church, drawing from both scripture and early Christian traditions, discouraged and often outright forbade dissection. A body, they believed, should remain whole until the day of resurrection. If it were cut, desecrated or destroyed, would the soul find it again? Would it rise on Judgment Day, torn and fragmented? This was not metaphor. It was literal fear, a fear that echoed in decrees, in councils, in quiet threats passed down through universities and monasteries. As a result, the medical world of medieval Europe became frozen in time. Instead of opening the human body, scholars opened books, and the book they trusted most was the work of Galen. Galen of Pergamon was a Roman physician who had lived over 1,000 years earlier. He was brilliant, observant, meticulous. But Galen had never dissected a human body. His knowledge came from animals, mostly pigs and apes. And yet, for medieval scholars, his word was law. If Galen said a liver had 5 lobes, then it had 5 lobes, even if a human body suggested otherwise. To question Galen was to question the foundation of medicine, and to question that foundation was to challenge centuries of belief. Thus, for hundreds of years, medical knowledge stood still. Illnesses were blamed on imbalanced humours, blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile. Fever was a result of excess heat, mental illness, too much black bile, or too much sin. Bleeding was a common treatment. Release the bad humours and restore the balance. It was tidy, theological, and often fatal. But beneath this stillness, some had begun to stir. In cities where the church's grip was looser, where trade routes brought ideas alongside spices and ink, a different kind of medicine was beginning to rise. In the northern Italian cities of Bologna and Padua, the streets echoed not just with merchants and monks, but with murmured defiance. There, in the 13th and 14th centuries, stood 2 of Europe's oldest medical schools, and behind their solemn gates, in the flicker of oil lamps and the hush of heavy stone halls, the human body was returning to view. Dissections were not legal exactly, but they were tolerated. At first, only criminals were used, bodies already condemned by both church and state. Their sins, it was thought, made their flesh less sacred, and so, under the right bribes, with the right letters of permission, anatomy could proceed, carefully, quietly. The dissections were not like modern surgery. They were ceremonial, almost theatrical. The professor stood above, reading Galen's text aloud. Below, a barber surgeon, often illiterate, cut the body open. If the text and the body disagreed, it was assumed the body was flawed. Perhaps the corpse was deformed. Perhaps sin had twisted the organs, but Galen could not be wrong. Still, some students began to notice. The liver was not five-lobed. The breastbone was not one solid piece. The human jaw was made of one bone, not two. These were not minor errors. They were cracks in a 1,000-year-old wall, and eventually one man would walk through them. His name was Andreas Vesalius, born in 1514 in Brussels, educated in Paris, trained in Padua. Vesalius was not content to recite Galen. He cut, he drew, he challenged. In 1543, at only 28 years old, he published a book that would reshape anatomy forever, De Humani Corporis Fabrica, on the fabric of the human body. Its pages pulsed with life. Detailed engravings of muscle and bone, nerve and tendon, rendered not from theory but from direct observation. For the first time in over a millennium, the body had been seen as it was, not as it was imagined, not as it was supposed to be, but as it truly was. Vesalius's work was a revelation and a risk, because in correcting Galen, he did not just correct science. He challenged the sanctity of tradition. If Galen had been wrong, who else might be? And if the body could be misread for so long, what of the soul? What else had been accepted without proof? Some praised him, some condemned him. Some whispered that he had dissected not just criminals, but saints, or worse. Rumours swirled that he had fled execution, that he died on a pilgrimage in penance, that his hands, so steady, so bold, were cursed. None of it can be proven, but the fear behind the stories, that was real, because Vesalius had done what so few dared to do. He trusted his eyes over the ancients. He believed the body more than the book, and in doing so, he broke something open. Others followed, slowly, cautiously. Each new dissection, each new drawing peeled back more than skin. It peeled back assumption, dogma, fear. And though the church still held sway, though anatomy remained controversial, a door had been opened, and behind it medicine waited, quiet, patient, ready. But medicine was not the only force stirring. Outside the lecture halls, in the streets, in the fields, death was coming, and this time it would leave no body untouched. It began, they say, with rats, or perhaps fleas, or perhaps a merchant ship docking in Sicily, its crew already dying. No one knew for certain, but by the time the bells tolled and the fires were lit, it was too late. The year was 1347, and Europe was about to be undone. The Black Death swept through towns and cities like a storm without wind. It did not knock. It entered, unseen, unannounced, and within days. Entire households were gone, swollen lymph nodes, blackened skin, fevers that burned like judgment, a death that came fast and without reason. It moved faster than the messengers, faster than the prayers, faster than the understanding of any man. By the time the first wave ended in 1351, an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population was gone. Mothers, priests, lords, bakers, scholars, children, no one was spared, no one could explain, and so they turned to the only certainty they knew, God, or rather, his anger. To the medieval mind, disease was not caused by bacteria or bad hygiene. It was punishment for sin, for pride, for vanity, for heresy, for secret wickedness, for cities grown too proud. Sermons declared the plague a divine correction. Processions filled the streets, barefoot, sobbing, flogging their own backs in search of forgiveness. Men known as flagellants moved from town to town, whipping themselves raw, chanting prayers. They begged for mercy, but the plague did not listen. People turned on each other. Blame had to fall somewhere, on the Jews, accused of poisoning wells, on the poor, accused of filth, on women, accused of consorting with devils, and among the panic, among the grief and the groaning carts of the dead. Another kind of suspicion took root, suspicion of those who did not fall ill. Who was still standing? Who seemed to survive? Who had knowledge, but no divine title? Who dared to treat the sick? Midwives, herbalists, healers, those who knew the plants that soothed a cough, who knew how to boil linens, who kept to themselves, and were now seen with fearful wonder. Some thought them blessed, others thought them unnatural, and in a world unravelling, unnatural quickly became evil. And yet, amid the screams and the smoke and the stench, a different question was beginning to form. A quiet one, a dangerous one. What if this is not God's wrath, but something else, something natural? Some began to observe patterns. The plague spread more quickly in cities. It thrived in filth, in crowded homes, near the dead. A few scholars noted that those who handled the sick often died next, that it moved through contact, not thought. A few even suggested isolation, cleanliness, barriers. They were not yet speaking of germs, but they were beginning to speak of contagion, and to do so was to challenge centuries of belief, because if a disease could spread without sin, if it could be understood, if it could be predicted, then it was not a message from God. It was a phenomenon, and that terrified many more than the disease itself. Doctors who suggested such things were often ignored, or worse, accused of sorcery. Some were arrested for using unfamiliar treatments. Some were condemned for studying the dead, because in the face of divine punishment, human solutions seemed like arrogance, or heresy, or both. But the questions had been asked, and once asked, they did not die, even if their askers did, even if their answers were buried beneath plague pits, even if their names were forgotten. The questions remained, and with each passing wave of disease, each recurrence, each year of death, more people looked not to altars, but to anatomy, not to miracles, but to methods. And though centuries would pass before medicine truly bloomed, the roots were planted here, in blood, in sorrow, in silence. In the centuries before due process, before juries and forensics, justice was not a matter of proof. It was a matter of divine revelation, and the favoured tool, suffering. If you were accused of heresy, of sorcery, of unnatural knowledge, the trial did not begin with questions. It began with pain. You might be bound and thrown into water. If you floated, you were guilty. Rejected by the purity of the holy element, if you sank, you were innocent, though often already drowned, or you might be forced to walk across burning iron, If your feet healed cleanly in 3 days, God had spoken in your favor. If they blistered and festered, well, the fire had told the truth. These were called trials by ordeal, tests designed not to uncover evidence, but to summon a divine verdict, and they were terrifyingly common, especially for those accused not of crimes of violence, but of crimes of thought, of ideas, of inquiry. A scholar who questioned the Church's stance on medicine, a healer who practiced without clerical oversight, a midwife whose patient died. They might all be subjected to these rituals, not because they were proven guilty, but because they could not prove innocence. And when ordeal gave way to interrogation, the process only grew darker. Torture, sanctioned by church and state alike, was seen as a tool for truth. The rack, the thumbscrew, the strappado, where the accused was hung by the wrists and dropped, tearing joints from their sockets. The iron boot, the iron tongue tearer. Inquisitors used them not with cruelty, they believed, but with righteous intent. They were not punishing, they were uncovering, because it was assumed that truth could be pulled from the flesh, if only the pain was sharp enough. And so many confessed, not because they were guilty, but because their bodies could take no more. Some admitted to healing with herbs, guided by demons. Some confessed to reading forbidden texts. Some, under unbearable pressure, even claimed to consort with spirits or call down storms. And once the confession was signed, there was no turning back. You could recant, but it wouldn't save you, because confession was the goal, not redemption, and certainly not understanding. This is how science and heresy became intertwined, not because science was evil, but because it asked questions, and because those questions had to be punished. As the Inquisition tightened its grip and whispers grew sharper than swords, a new terror took hold of Europe, the witch craze. What had once been suspicion, quiet, scattered, local, now became a movement, fueled by books like the Malleus Maleficarum, encouraged by church tribunals and inflamed by rumour. The witch trials swept across towns and kingdoms like wildfire, and within them a chilling evolution occurred. The tools of science, herbs, instruments, observations, were now counted as evidence of sorcery. An herb garden was no longer a sign of healing, it was proof of potion making. A woman's knowledge of weather patterns, once praised for saving crops, became an accusation of stormcraft. A midwife's success rate was no longer seen as skill, but as a result of dark pacts. And if a philosopher dared to speak of natural forces, of unseen causes, of mathematical laws, he too might find himself named, not as a thinker, but as a man of unnatural arts. The line between science and heresy vanished beneath ash and fear, and in this atmosphere, anything could be used against you. Did a storm strike a village? Someone had summoned it. Did hail destroy a harvest? Someone had angered God. Did a nobleman's child fall ill? A neighbour had likely poisoned the air. The idea that such things could happen without cause, or worse, through natural causes, was not comforting. It was unthinkable, because in a world ruled by divine will, only intentional evil could explain senseless suffering, and that intent had to be found and punished. And so, trials grew stranger. Judges began asking about dreams, about secret meetings in the woods, about flying ointments made of herbs and fat. Scholars were asked to explain why they drew circles with stars inside them. Was it astronomy, or was it conjuring? Could the same diagram be found in both a textbook and a grimoire? If so, was there truly any difference? Even tools became suspect. A mortar and pestle, a telescope, a brass astrolabe. Simple instruments for study became markers of arcane knowledge, too complex for common use, too unfamiliar for comfort, too clever to be innocent. And the accused? They were not only old women in hovels, they were priests, midwives, physicians, apothecaries. Some were women, some were men. All had one thing in common. They knew something others did not. And in this age, knowledge without permission was the most dangerous power of all. In the dungeons of Würzburg, in the burning squares of Bamberg, in the villages of Scotland, France, Switzerland, thousands were tried. Tens of thousands were executed, not for crime, not for harm, but for proximity to the unexplainable. And much of that unexplainable was simply science. The way an herb could still a fever, the way a magnet could pull iron, the way a lens could bring the moon closer, all of it felt like magic, until someone said it wasn't. But in this world, saying that too early could get you killed. There are many ways to silence a voice. You can imprison the body that speaks it. You can torture the breath from the lungs. You can frighten others from listening. But there is one method more permanent than all the rest. You can burn the words themselves. Across medieval Europe, in the wake of trials and fear, a quieter fire began to spread. A fire set not to flesh, but to parchment, to ink, to ideas. Libraries, once rare, treasured sanctuaries, became battlegrounds of belief. Inquisitors combed their shelves for heretical texts, books that questioned doctrine, books that came from the East, books that spoke too plainly about the natural world. Some were seized and banned, some were locked away in vaults, never to be opened, and many were simply destroyed. The flames that consumed them were not accidental, they were public, ceremonial, proof that orthodoxy remained unchallenged. Tomes by Arabic philosophers, Avicenna, Averroes, Alhazen, gone. Treatises on medicine, astronomy, mathematics, vanished. Not because they were wrong, but because they were dangerous. Because they offered alternative explanations to divine mystery, because they worked. And things that worked, outside of church-sanctioned authority, were threats. Even the possession of such a book could lead to suspicion. A copy of Aristotle, with marginal notes. A translation from Greek to Latin, unapproved. A medical text that referenced ancient, non-Christian remedies. It didn't matter if you understood it. It mattered that you had it, that you had chosen to preserve what others feared. In some places, scribes began to self-censor. They erased certain diagrams, they scratched out passages, they left blank spaces in the margins where commentary once lived. They did it not out of loyalty, but out of survival, because knowledge, even copied faithfully, could now bring death. Yet not all bowed. Some hid their books. Some memorized entire texts before setting them alight, keeping the words alive inside their minds. Some wrapped pages in oilskin and buried them beneath orchard trees, beside wells, under chapel floors, and centuries later we would find them, charred, torn, crumbling, but still speaking. These were not only books of science, they were maps of human thought, evidence that even in the darkest centuries the mind had not stopped moving. That curiosity, though punished, had never died, and that perhaps the greatest threat to tyranny was not rebellion, but a quiet page. That said, there is another way to see the world. From the 8th to the 13th century, a remarkable flowering of knowledge unfolded across the Islamic world, a golden age, not only of faith and empire, but of science, medicine, philosophy, and mathematics. In cities like Baghdad, Cordoba, Cairo, and Samarkand, libraries soared higher than towers. Scholars gathered not to silence doubt, but to explore it, to question, to debate, to test. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad became the beating heart of this movement. There, teams of translators worked tirelessly, preserving Greek, Persian, Indian, and Egyptian texts. They didn't just copy, they commented, expanded, corrected, and in doing so, they laid the foundations of modern science. One of them was Al-Khwarizmi. A mathematician, astronomer, and geographer, he wrote texts that would introduce algebra to the world, a word that itself comes from his title, Al-Jabr. He devised methods for solving equations, calculating interest, mapping celestial bodies. His work would become the foundation for what we now call algorithms. Without him, there is no modern computation. Then came Avicenna, or Ibn Sina, a polymath who wrote over 400 books on topics from theology to logic, chemistry to psychology. His masterpiece, the Canon of Medicine, remained one of the most authoritative medical texts in both the Islamic world and Europe for over 600 years. He spoke of contagious disease, of the need for clinical trials, of the importance of mental health. And then there was Al-Hazan, Ibn al-Haytham, a physicist who explored optics, the behavior of light, the structure of the eye. He devised early experiments using camera obscuras. He insisted that truth must be found through observation and evidence, not assumption. 1,000 years before the scientific method had a name, he was already using it. Their work, and the work of countless others, represented not magic, but method, not heresy, but human curiosity refined by faith. For in the Islamic world, to study nature was to admire its creator. To understand creation was not rebellion, but reverence. And yet, their words would not remain in Arabic. In time, they would be carried west, not by conquest, but by translation. From the edges of the Christian world, in Toledo, Palermo, Sicily, a quiet revolution began. Teams of scholars, many of them Jewish or Muslim converts, began to translate Arabic texts into Latin. They opened windows Europe had forgotten were once there, and through those windows ideas poured in. But as these texts crossed borders, so too did the fear, because while the knowledge was valuable, the source of that knowledge, non-Christian, non-European, often Arabic, made it suspect. To some in medieval Europe, these were not just books, they were contaminated vessels, vessels of dangerous thought, of alien logic, of truths born outside the Church's domain. Scholars who translated these works often faced uneasy questions. Where did this knowledge come from? Was it inspired by God or by other forces? Could such brilliance in astronomy, algebra, chemistry truly be the product of Islamic thinkers? Or had they stolen it, twisted it, received it from dark spirits cloaked in scholarly robes? Such questions reveal more than just prejudice. They reveal the depth of insecurity that ran beneath Christian Europe's intellectual elite. Because the truth was unavoidable, the Arab world had preserved what Europe had forgotten. It had built on it. It had carried the torch of reason while the West wandered in shadows, and now that the light was returning, the hand that held the torch looked foreign, and to many, that made it frightening. There were theological complications too. Much of this science made no room for miracles. It dealt in laws, not blessings, forces, not saints, mechanics, not mysteries. It didn't ask for prayer, it asked for calculation, and that, to some, felt like a rejection of grace. A rejection of God's will. Because if nature could be predicted, controlled, explained, then what of divine intervention? What of the sacred order? What of the Church's role in defining reality? Even the very language of these texts made them suspect. Arabic script, geometric patterns, unfamiliar names like Ibn and El. To the average European monk, these looked like enchantments. Even after translation, Arabic words clung to the margins. Algebra, alchemy, zenith, azimuth. They lingered like fingerprints, reminders that this was not native knowledge. It had come from outside the garden wall. And so, while some European scholars embraced these ideas, others condemned them. They called them pagan science, infidel logic, or worse, sorcerous astronomy. And sometimes merely citing an Arabic name in your manuscript was enough to bring accusations, not because the ideas were wrong, but because they were not ours. Even those who championed the new knowledge, thinkers like Roger Bacon and Albertus Magnus, had to tread carefully. They praised Arabic scholars, but always paired their admiration with caution. They often framed their learning as rescuing truth from Islamic hands, as if truth itself had been imprisoned. It was not a dialogue, it was a reclamation. This is how fear masks itself in reverence, how a culture can admire what it does not trust, and steal from what it refuses to thank. But ideas are not loyal. They move through time and language like wind. They cross borders not with swords, but with questions. And even as Europe burned witches and banned books, it could not stop those questions from taking root, because the minds of Arabic scholars had left something behind, a foundation, and above it the West would soon begin to build. But not before one last wave of contradiction, a wave carried home not by merchants or scribes, but by soldiers. They came in waves, knights draped in crosses, priests with scrolls of blessing, foot soldiers with little more than hunger and hope. The Crusades, launched in the 11th century, were meant to reclaim Holy Land, to defend God's truth, to retake Jerusalem, to restore the Church's dignity. But they would bring home more than just battle scars and fragments of saints. They would return with strange knowledge. Along the dusty roads of Palestine, through the gates of Damascus, Antioch and Acre, the Crusaders saw cities far more advanced than many of their own. They encountered hospitals, clean, ordered, with separate wards and protocols. They saw libraries where texts in Greek, Persian, Syriac and Arabic were copied and catalogued. They saw instruments, armillary spheres, surgical tools, compasses and devices to measure the stars, and even if they did not understand what they were seeing, they remembered it. Some of what they returned with was material: astrolabes, surgical manuals, glass lenses, books of strange geometry. But what they carried in deeper ways was something more subtle, a sense that the world was wider, that knowledge could come in unfamiliar forms, that the boundaries of truth were more porous than they had imagined. and yet what could not be explained was often feared. A soldier who had seen a physician treat wounds with silver dust and succeed might return with unease. How had he done it? No relic had been used, no prayer invoked. Was it skill, or was it sorcery? A knight who had watched a Muslim astronomer chart the night sky with tools he'd never seen and predict an eclipse with eerie precision might speak of it in awe, but also with dread, because what lies outside one's own understanding is easily cast as otherworldly. And so, a strange duality settled over Europe. On one hand, it borrowed, hungrily, from Arabic science. On the other, it painted the cultures that birthed that science as dark, pagan, demonic. The word Saracen became shorthand for both brilliance and threat, a place of elegant architecture and feared magic, of healing and heresy, of wisdom and war. The fear deepened over time, not only of Islam, but of anything Eastern. The mathematical precision, the unfamiliar script, the sheer confidence of scholars who did not bow to Rome. All of it was admired and rejected, used and denied, and that tension would echo for centuries. In time, many of the Arabic sources would be erased, their ideas rebranded as European rediscoveries, their names footnoted or forgotten, but the influence remained, deeply embedded in the very fabric of learning, in the equations used to build cathedrals, in the star maps that guided explorers, in the prescriptions that soothed fevered children. And though many never knew their names, they owed their breath to Ibn Sina, their reason to Al-Kindi, their vision to Alhazen, their foundations to a world once considered foreign but never truly separate, because knowledge, once shared, does not belong to anyone. It becomes a part of everyone. Knowledge is not only about what we know, it is about who is allowed to say it. And in medieval Europe, for nearly 1,000 years, there was one institution that held that right with a grip tighter than any king: the Church. To speak of truth in the medieval world was not a philosophical matter, it was a theological one. Truth was not discovered, it was delivered by God through Scripture interpreted by the Church, and any truth that came from elsewhere had to be reconciled to that order or rejected entirely. This was not mere tradition, it was a system of control. The Church's role extended far beyond souls and sermons. It was the final authority on morality, law, history, medicine, the cosmos, and the body itself. And this power was not theoretical, it was enforced. Popes did not simply preach. They banned books, they convened councils to condemn ideas, they ordered the arrest of thinkers. They could excommunicate a man with a sentence, cut him off from salvation, from burial, from family and God. And that power extended not only to those who denied the Church, but to those who simply asked too much. Because science, when it appeared, did not arrive with violence. It arrived with questions, and questions left unanswered could spread. They could open cracks in sacred walls, and from those cracks might pour doubt. What if the heavens did not move as the Scriptures claimed? What if illness came from contagion, not from sin? What if the earth moved? And if it did, what else might move? What else might change? These were not just academic musings, they were seen as threats to the entire spiritual architecture of society, because the Church did not merely interpret reality, it defined it. And if that authority was challenged, the whole world, moral, legal, eternal, might begin to crumble. Thus, natural philosophers, the early scientists, found themselves in a dangerous position. They were not soldiers, they were not rebels, They were men, and occasionally women, of thought, but thought, unchecked, could be revolutionary. Popes like Gregory IX, Innocent III, and later Paul IV moved swiftly when ideas veered too far from orthodoxy. Councils condemned doctrines they could not control. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the index of forbidden books, was not just a list. It was a weapon, a reminder that even parchment could be treason, even ink could be damnable. And as science crept forward, it was forced to wear the mask of faith, not because its seekers were godless, but because they needed protection. To be curious in this world was to disguise curiosity, to bow before the altar even while sketching the stars, to include prayers in treatises on astronomy, to end each hypothesis with, "if it please God," because if God was not pleased, there would be consequences. Universities were meant to be sanctuaries, places of learning, of logic, of language and light, and in many ways the medieval universities were that. Bologna, Paris, Oxford, Salamanca, they became beacons for scholarship in a dark and rigid world. But these institutions did not stand outside the church's reach, they stood within it, and as a result, they were never truly free. To enter a university was to step into a world ruled by Latin, by hierarchy, by doctrine. It was a place where one could read Aristotle, but only under the church's guidance. One could explore astronomy, so long as the earth remained still. One could study medicine, so long as the soul was never questioned. These were not laboratories of freedom, they were gardens with high walls. And though ideas bloomed within them, they did so under careful watch. At the heart of this paradox was scholasticism, a method of learning that sought to merge reason with revelation. Its goal was not to dismantle theology, but to fortify it with logic. Scholars like Thomas Aquinas and Peter Abelard believed that faith and reason could walk hand in hand, that the natural world, properly understood, would affirm divine truth. It was an attempt at harmony, a noble effort to bind the restless mind to the stable soul, and at times it worked. Aquinas' Summa Theologica stands even today as a monument of synthesis, where God is explained not only through scripture, but through argument. But even in its elegance, scholasticism had a flaw. It assumed that reason would always lead to God, and it demanded that if ever the two disagreed, reason must bend. This was the tether placed around scientific inquiry. Explore, yes, but do not contradict. Dissect, but do not question the divine image. Calculate, but do not disturb the central place of man in the cosmos. If the world began to look too mechanical, too natural, then pull back, or be pulled. Yet, within these constraints, students still asked, professors still taught. They wrote commentaries on Aristotle that stretched the bounds of orthodoxy. They diagrammed the heavens more precisely than was safe. They debated the soul's relationship to the body in ways that made bishops uneasy, and sometimes they went too far and were denounced. But other times, they found protection in the very institution that watched them, because universities, though church-sanctioned, had their own momentum. They had rivalries, factions, eccentricities, and occasionally they sheltered rebels in robes. It was in the lecture halls and libraries of these universities that Europe began, ever so slowly, to rediscover method, to respect evidence, to pursue clarity even when it trembled at the edge of heresy. These halls produced Vesalius, who challenged Galen. They gave rise to Copernicus, who would dare to move the earth. They trained students who would one day become revolutionaries of thought. And though many of these thinkers would be condemned, they were born in places built to uphold the very order they would break. That is the irony of power. Its tools can become its undoing. The very walls raised to contain ideas may, with time, echo them louder than ever before. Not all battles over knowledge were waged in libraries or cloisters. Some took place in palaces, because knowledge in the right or wrong hands was power, and in the late medieval world that power could be used not just to understand the cosmos, but to crush a rival, to remove a threat, to silence a voice. Kings and queens, bishops and barons, they all knew the stakes. A scholar who questioned the heavens might one day question the throne. A healer who defied church doctrine might also defy a lord's decree. A thinker who taught the people to reason might teach them to refuse obedience. And so, science, or what little of it flickered in those centuries, became not just a target of fear, but a political tool. Accusations of sorcery were no longer about superstition, they were strategies. A noble family with land to protect might whisper that a rival had hired an astrologer to curse their crops. A court physician who fell out of favour might be accused of poisoning the prince, not through toxins, but through forbidden arts. A scholar whose writings offended the wrong patron might be said to consort with spirits, even if all he had done was translate a Greek text too faithfully. The accusation itself became enough, because once science had been linked to heresy, to witchcraft, to defiance of God. No further evidence was needed, only fear, and fear was easy to spread, especially when the public already believed that books could bite, that potions could summon storms, that a star chart might shift the fate of kings. In this way, monarchs and bishops alike began to wield science like a blade. They could celebrate it when it served them, praising engineers who built siege machines or navigators who charted foreign waters, and condemn it when it questioned their moral authority. The same stars used to time a coronation could damn a man to the pyre if he read them without permission. Even those who believed in science feared what it might do in the wrong hands. The wrong ideas, the wrong books, the wrong questions, posed at the wrong time, could unravel everything. So kings consulted alchemists in private, but imprisoned them in public. Popes ordered observatories built, then burned astrologers who saw too much. This was not contradiction, it was control. Perhaps the clearest example of this paradox came not in the age of Galileo, not yet, but in the quiet dealings of courts across Europe. Letters sent, books banned, advisors removed, reputations ruined, lives ended, and all because a man had asked a question no one had the power to answer, without fear. Some survived by aligning their work with rulers. They offered predictions, calculated eclipses for ceremonial events, built machines that glorified kingship. They tied their craft to divine right, to the will of heaven, to the unshakable hierarchy of God, king, and man, and for a time, that shielded them. But even that was a cage, because so long as knowledge had to serve power, it could never be truly free. It could never lead, only follow, and the moment it led too far, it would be brought to heel, or to trial, or to flame. The quiet revolutionaries. Some stories are not shouted, they are whispered. in dimly lit chambers, in letters folded into sleeves, in ink that fades as eyes grow old. Some ideas are not defended by armies. They survive in margins, in footnotes, in cautious nods between those who understand, in the silence between punishments, in the breath held just before truth is spoken. Lived the quiet revolutionaries, and among them, one of the first, was a man called Roger Bacon. He was born in England in the early 13th century, a Franciscan friar with a sharp mind and a sharper appetite for truth. While others debated angels on pinheads, Roger Bacon studied lenses. He calculated the properties of light. He spoke of refraction, of mirrors, of perspective, and beneath his brown robe and humble posture lived a soul that did not want to destroy the church, but to illuminate it. Bacon believed that the natural world could be understood through observation. That knowledge was not only inherited, but discovered. He believed that experimentum was essential, that books were valuable but insufficient, that truth could not be dictated, it had to be seen. Centuries before Galileo would lift a telescope, before Descartes would dissect certainty, before Newton would catch an apple mid-fall in the net of law, Bacon was already calling for a method, a process rooted in observation, hypothesis, testing, refinement. He was, in all but name, an architect of the scientific method. And yet his vision, so clear, so promising, was too soon, too bold, too unbound. He spoke of future inventions, flying machines, eyeglasses, telescopes, engines powered by heat and pressure. He was not dreaming. He was projecting, and it scared them, because men of God were not meant to peer so far into the future. They were not meant to look so closely into the laws that governed light and shadow. His writings, particularly the Opus Majus, caught the attention of Pope Clement IV, who, for a time, offered him protection. But the Pope died, and Roger Bacon's protection died with him. Soon after, Bacon was imprisoned by his own Franciscan order. They claimed it was for suspected novelties, for disobedience, for stirring too many thoughts. He spent over a decade in silence, not because his ideas were false, but because they were too right, too fast, and from the wrong mouth. When he was finally released, his work would be copied, misunderstood, and only truly appreciated centuries later. But the stone he dropped, the ripples had begun. He would not be the last to sit in the dark, hoping the world would one day see the light. Not all revolutionaries carried quills and calculations. Some wore veils, spoke in hymns, wrote in visions, and among them perhaps none shone more quietly than Hildegard of Bingen. Born in 1098 in the green hills of the Rhineland, Hildegard was offered to the church as a child, enclosed in a monastery, shut away from the world. But what grew behind those stone walls was not silence. It was sound, colour, curiosity, a mind that, despite its confinement, roamed farther than many armies. Hildegard claimed that her insights came not from books nor from tutors, but from visions. Light poured into her eyes, she said. God showed her the inner workings of creation, and from these visions, she wrote, Scivias, Physica, Liber Vitae Meritorum, works that blended theology, natural observation, botany, music, medicine, and prophecy. In an age when women were silenced in public discourse, Hildegard sang. She described how the body worked, how herbs could heal, how celestial bodies moved. She offered remedies for fever, for melancholy, for digestion and childbirth. She composed hymns and theological poetry. She even theorized about the balance of bodily fluids and the mind's effect on illness. Her writings spanned anatomy, psychology, zoology, and astronomy, all disguised within spiritual language. Because had she written plainly, she would not have been read, she would have been condemned. So Hildegard cloaked her knowledge in divine revelation. Her natural philosophy was framed as God's song, not her own. Her diagnoses were filtered through scriptural symbols. Her confidence, unshakable, almost audacious, was tempered by the claim that she was merely a vessel, a mouth through which God whispered. And it worked. Popes read her, bishops praised her, kings wrote to her for advice. She became, without question, one of the most influential women of the 12th century, and yet, much of what she recorded was science, ancient and empirical, gathered from observation, practice, and intuition. She studied plants, she categorized stones, she noticed how emotion changed breath and sleep. She saw patterns in weather, in dreams, in the body's cycles, and she preserved that knowledge in song, in image, in coded text. Was she a mystic? Yes, but also a scientist, one hidden behind a veil of visions, because that veil was the only thing keeping her safe. There is a kind of genius that learns to wear a mask, not to lie, but to survive, to encode truth within metaphor, to slip knowledge between the lines of prayers, and in doing so, to pass it on, not loudly, not defiantly, but surely and forever. Not all ideas survive through libraries. Sometimes they survive through hands, passed from one thinker to another, folded into letters, scratched in margins, hidden beneath sacred texts. In an age when speaking too clearly meant death, some minds formed circles, unseen, unspoken, but vital. These weren't secret societies in the romantic sense, no cloaks, no ceremonies. They were networks, made of scribes, of monks, of apprentices, of curious nobles, of women who read by candlelight in abbeys, of scholars who dared to copy one more page before the bishop arrived. They met in shadowed gardens, in hidden rooms behind altars, in the quietest corners of great libraries. And what bound them wasn't loyalty or rebellion, but a single shared instinct. That truth mattered, even if it had to hide. They wrote in layers, a theological text on the surface, and in the margin, a note about planetary motion, a medical remedy not found in scripture. A question: could fire be its own substance? To the untrained eye, meaningless. To the initiated, a beacon. Symbols were used. The triangle might mean more than the Trinity. The Ouroboros, the snake eating its tail, might signal a manuscript worth reading. Circles, spirals, constellations, not decoration, not magic, but clues. Some passed entire texts under false titles. A book of Psalms, whose spine hid a treatise on magnetism. A monk's diary that recorded not confessions, but anatomical observations made during illicit dissections. They borrowed each other's words, sometimes deliberately misattributed them to long-dead saints or fictional Greek names. Why? because a saint could speak where a scientist could not, because fiction could travel where fact would be burned. In the libraries of Toledo, Bologna, Paris, you can still find these ghost networks, their traces. A thumb-smudged margin with a date that predates the official discovery of a comet. A side note questioning the four elements. A small, precise diagram drawn beside a list of Latin prayers. Of something that looks eerily like a parabolic mirror. No one knows how many there were. We only know they were enough. Enough to keep ideas alive when ideas were not welcome. Enough to stitch a silent thread between centuries. Enough to pass on the spark, until one day someone could finally speak without fear. They were not famous, most of their names are lost, but their fingerprints remain, on vellum, on stone, in the gaps between the lines. They didn't seek credit, they sought continuity. And in the end, that may be the most radical act of all, not to shout, but to whisper the future into being. For centuries, ideas had been fragile things, copied by hand, bound in calfskin, hidden in vaults. To possess a single book was to hold months of labour. To share a thought meant to trust a scribe, a parchment, a courier, and to pray that ink and memory would endure. But in the mid-15th century, in the quiet city of Mainz, Germany, a man named Johannes Gutenberg cracked the sky. He didn't build a telescope. He didn't chart the stars. He built a machine, a press of wood and metal, and with it, letters became multiples, words became weapons, and knowledge, for the first time in Europe, became repeatable. The printing press changed more than how people read. It changed who could read. It changed how quickly ideas moved. And, most dangerously, it changed how tightly those ideas could be controlled. Because now, they couldn't. The church, once able to monitor every manuscript, found itself chasing dozens of editions. A book that once took months to copy could now be made in hours. Pamphlets, treatises, diagrams, almanacs, they flooded cities and towns, and not just in Latin, but in vernacular tongues, German, French, Italian, English. Now a farmer could read what once only a monk could touch. Now a merchant could question the heavens. Now a student could own what his father had never seen. Among the flood of texts were not only Bibles, but science, old works, Galen, Hippocrates, Ptolemy, now available in printed form, and newer voices too, Bacon's treatises, alchemical charts, herbals, anatomical drawings. The gatekeepers were overwhelmed, the walls could no longer hold, the whispers were no longer whispers, they were being printed. And each time a book was burned, another 5 could rise to take its place. Every attempt to silence became a signal flare, an invitation for others to read, to question, to doubt. Not everyone welcomed it. Censors still worked. Printers were sometimes arrested. Books were confiscated. But the tide was turning, and with it, the monopoly on knowledge began to crack. Not because minds had changed, but because machines had made it impossible not to listen. A scholar in Florence receives a printed copy of Pliny's Natural History. He copies a note in the margin. 3 months later, a merchant in Venice holds the same text, the same note. An idea has now travelled hundreds of miles, without a single monk lifting a quill. It is unstoppable, and those who fear it can now only try to delay it. The printed page had unleashed ideas, but what now stirred behind those words was something deeper. A new spirit, at once ancient and yet entirely new, was waking in the minds of Europe, a whisper that said, look not only upward, but inward. This was the age of humanism, and it was not just a shift in style, it was a revolution in how humans saw themselves. Renaissance humanism was not born in protest. It began as a return, a reaching back to the texts, philosophies and observations of ancient Greece and Rome. To Plato and Aristotle, yes, but also to Lucretius, Archimedes, Pythagoras, Cicero, Galen, voices of reason who had long slumbered beneath layers of theological dust. These old names were not blasphemous anymore. They were fashionable. And with their revival came the radical idea that the human being, not the church, not the crown, was the measure of all things. Where medieval art had once flattened the world, rendering faces as symbols of divine stories, now artists painted depth, emotion, muscle, shadow. They painted the world as it was seen, not as it was dictated. At the center of this quiet rebellion stood one towering mind, Leonardo da Vinci, painter, engineer, anatomist, philosopher. He studied birds in flight just to understand how a man might one day fly. He dissected corpses, sketching muscles and sinews with aching precision, not out of morbid curiosity, but from a desperate hunger to understand the engine beneath the skin. He made notes, thousands of them, on everything from hydraulics to embryology, all written in mirrored script, as if even he feared being read too soon. Da Vinci's art and science were not separate things, they were fused. Each sketch a meditation, each invention a prayer to the god of mechanism, not miracle. Each page a bridge between wonder and calculation. He didn't seek to undo faith. He simply chose to see what was really there, and what he saw was breathtaking. But it wasn't just Leonardo. Across Europe, the chain reaction had begun. Petrarch, Erasmus, Boccaccio, Vesalius, all of them drawing inspiration from the ancients yet crafting new frameworks. In Florence, the Medici funded both cathedrals and curiosity. In Venice, publishers churned out books not just for priests, but for physicians, navigators, painters, and philosophers. And in universities, the old scholastic model, reason bound in theological chains, began to fray. There was a new method now: observe, compare, question, test. It wasn't safe yet, but it was louder. The sun hadn't risen, but you could now see the glow on the horizon, and you could hear the unmistakable shuffle of minds preparing to step into the light. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, the world had not yet changed, but it was no longer the same. The trembling of old certainties had grown into a rhythm, the slow, deliberate drumbeat of curiosity stepping into the open. Questions no longer hid. They strutted, argued, debated in public squares, in courts, in books whose bindings spread across continents. And on the edge of this rising tide stood three figures who would not whisper, they would shout. Galileo Galilei, René Descartes, Isaac Newton. Their time had not yet come, but the world was preparing for them. The soil was loosening, the guardians of silence were aging, and the spark was about to ignite the storm. Galileo, born in 1564, would one day lift a telescope to the heavens and see what no man before him had confirmed: that Jupiter had moons, that Venus had phases, that the stars were more numerous than sand, and most heretically, that the earth moved. He would prove it not with scripture, but with evidence, with glass and patience and a refusal to look away. For this he would be summoned, He would kneel before inquisitors. He would recant with his mouth, but not with his eyes. And even as he whispered the church's demanded words, he is said to have muttered under breath, "Et pour si mouve." And yet it moves. René Descartes, born in 1596, would pierce deeper still. He would tear down all knowledge and start again from doubt, from a single point, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. From this fragile truth, he would build a cathedral of reason, a world governed not by unseen forces, but by rules, by mechanism, by cause and effect. He spoke not as a mystic, but as a man laying the foundation stones of modern philosophy. And then, in 1642, the same year Galileo died, another light was born, Isaac Newton, quiet, private, relentless. By the time he was finished, the heavens were no longer mystical. They were measurable. The apple's fall and the moon's orbit, both governed by the same force, gravity. The stars no longer sang for God alone. Now they obeyed equations. And though Newton himself would remain a man of deep spiritual belief, he had lit the pathway forward. This was not yet the Enlightenment, not yet the age of reason, but it was its birth cry, a slow turning of the earth toward a new dawn, where ideas would no longer need veils, where books would not hide in shadows, where men and women could finally say, "I wonder," and not fear the stake. But this new age would not destroy the old one. It would carry its scars, its contradictions, its echoes. Science had been mistaken for sorcery. Because it was powerful, because it dared to name the forces of the world without kneeling, now that same power was rising again, but this time no longer in secret. It was stepping onto the stage, into the courtroom, into the lab, and soon into the world itself. Once the price of asking a question was your life. Once to write a formula in the wrong hand, to open a body in the wrong room, to watch the stars for too long, was to summon suspicion, and perhaps the flames. But now, these same thoughts are printed in textbooks, taught in classrooms, recited in lecture halls beneath glowing domes of steel and glass. They appear on computer screens, coded into simulations and experiments. The orbits of planets, the secrets of blood, the laws of light, once hidden, once punished, are now curriculum. The very pages that once smouldered in fire now form the foundations of every school, and yet the story is not finished. Because fear has not gone, it has only changed its shape. Where once the enemy was the book, now it is the idea that spreads too fast. Where once it was the spell in a bottle, now it is the data on a server. Where once the threat was the woman with herbs, now it may be the scientist who speaks truth to power, the whistleblower, the climate researcher, the geneticist, the doctor in a war zone. Still today, across the world, minds are silenced, not for being wrong, but for daring to be right too soon. We no longer burn books in town squares, but we do ban them. We no longer try thinkers as heretics, but we undermine, discredit, ignore. We say they are biased, dangerous, untrustworthy. We question the questioner, and in that way, the ghost of the old fear still lingers just beneath the surface, Because true science has always required more than intellect. It requires courage, and in the medieval age, that courage was born in darkness, in cloisters, in attics, in margins and ashes and bruises, in the trembling hand that passed a forbidden page, and the eyes that dared to read it. We owe our world not just to geniuses, but to the ones who risked everything. For something they might never see completed, they lit a single candle and passed it forward to us. So the next time we speak of progress, of innovation, of logic and evidence and technology and truth, let us also remember the cost. Let us remember that behind every clean equation there is ink, there is sweat, there is silence, and sometimes there is fire. So, as we come to the end of this story, let us not look only at the horror, at the fires and accusations and screams. Let us look too at the resilience, the quiet courage of those who whispered questions in the dark, who peered through primitive glass at the stars and thought, could it be that they follow laws? Who cracked bones not to curse them, but to map them? Who charted herbs not to hex, but to heal? They were called witches, they were called heretics, but in truth they were scientists. Before the word existed, before the world was ready,